In this section, I will prepare the fabric and cut the fabric for the blouse. This is a very old piece of beautiful, beautiful blue fabric that has a slight twill to it. It's very fragile. What I'm going to do is, along the cross grain, snip and pull a thread carefully and cut where that thread is no longer. You can see the line. I can see it certainly much more clearly than the viewer, but you should be able to see what I'm doing. It breaks every once in a while, so I can only go for a ways and then continue up. This will help me straighten the fabric. You can see that it was not exactly cut on grain. It was cut kind of at a diagonal. Without doing this, you would not be able to lay your patterns on perfect grain, addressing both cross and straight grain. That's a pretty big difference. That's about 2.5 inch difference. Often when I go to buy fabrics, I buy an extra 1/8 or 1/4 of a yard, because if they haven't been cut on straight grain, I'm going to lose fabric, and sometimes, look at the difference. Then you won't have enough to cut your garment. That's a massive amount of difference. Many, many years ago, in the 50s, possibly in the 60s, if one would go into a fabric store, the salesperson would actually take the time to pull grain like this and cut it, so you knew exactly what you were getting, and it was on perfect grain. So now I've gone to the other end of the fabric, and I'm going to do the same thing. You can see on this end, I have about 1/4 of an inch into the fabric. We'll see what the other end is like. Again, there's a huge difference. That's about 2-inch difference. That's massive. So you've really lost 4.5 inches of fabric. That's why it's really a good idea when you can to buy a little extra. Now I'm marking the wrong side on the length grain with arrows so that I don't get confused. Because this is a fabric that's been folded for a long, long time, I'm examining the crease in the middle. And right in the middle, where all those folds come together, I see something that I don't want cut into my blouse. fabric can wear, moths can get at it, and usually the crease is where the problem is. So I've marked this on the wrong side, and I want to make sure that when I cut the blouse, none of my blouse is cut in that area. There it is. As a matter of fact, I'm going to try to avoid using the crease if at all possible, except maybe in facings. We'll see. Depends on how much fabric I need for the garment. Now, to cut the selvages off, that's why I want to mark the grain line way inside the selvage. That's just to remind me, because sometimes it gets confusing. Now, there is a really nice demarcation, and so I'm cutting just a fraction inside the actual selvage so that the fabric relaxes. If I've mentioned it before, I believe that the selvage makes the fabric a little tighter in this area. You'll notice that especially when we get into woolens. The reason I'm not tearing this is because of the quality fabric that it is. Now, I didn't test it, but I've worked with fabrics a good while. And this one, if torn, it would damage the fabric. Muslin tears beautifully in either direction, but this would possibly make little runners like stockings, and it would just damage the edges. Now, putting all the edges together, the corners, the very edges of the length grain, cross grain, give it a good steaming. This is not a blouse fabric that I want to pop into the washing machine, but many cottons I will wash and even put in the dryer sometimes before I cut them and make them, so that they get washed well, all the sizing comes out, and they are pre-shrunk. But this one should be washed by hand or sent out to dry clean. It's just a beautiful fabric, but it's a rather delicate fabric. As you can see by the cross grains matching as well as they do, that this fabric really was not terribly unblocked. It was a pretty straight both ways. It didn't have to be blocked like you've seen me block muslin before. And to give it a good press on the other side, just to make sure that I get steam equally through both sides. I'm not pressing a hard crease on the fold. Now sometimes when I lay a pattern out onto fabric, I lay everything out. But in this particular case, I'm going to be sectioning these pieces off. Orienting my pattern piece against the straight edge of the length grain, not the folded edge. That's one less cutting line I will have. It helps the process go along a little more smoothly, a little more quickly when you can do this. Keeping in mind, I'm not going to, for instance, lay the center back of the back along the fold line. I need to really think about how I want to lay this out. First, I'll cut the front piece. Because I've been very careful to pull grain on the cross grains and also to cut the selvages off very evenly, I want to make sure that those don't slip around and they stay put while I place the pattern pieces on top and cut it out. So I'm securing them with some pins. I also noted that the fabric is sturdy enough that the length and cross grains fall at a good right angle. If a fabric is slippery like a silk charmeuse or crepe de chine, then you have to make your fabric lay on the table at right angles, and then you have to be extremely careful cutting or laying the cross grain on the perfect cross grain. Part of the reason I'm sectioning these pieces off is because the camera cannot show the whole layout. So if you can lay yours out all at once, it's probably a much easier and more efficient process. But what I'm doing here is pulling grain at the bottom hem of this piece. So I'm very conservative with my fabric, and I maintain keeping everything on cross and length grain perfectly. The fabric above this pattern piece is enough that I can use it. Now this fold area doesn't seem to be a problem and will steam out. So I can use this for small pieces. Measuring the cross grain down to the edges of the fabric. I'll go back and snip notches later. I've noticed that there's no cross grain on this sleeve facing piece. So I'm creating a cross grain perpendicular to the center straight grain. That little red line in the middle. And once again, just checking distances. That's kind of like checking this cross grain line. Just make sure that those tips are the same distance. The bottom edge of the fabric is the grain that I pulled. Even though you can see that the two edges don't match perfectly, they are pretty symmetrical, the same distance away from each other along the whole length of that fabric. Now I only need to cut one back, and this is a full pattern piece. So I've decided to cut one layer of fabric for this, snip and pull the grain, by putting the selvage edges together and the cross grain at the far right. I'm putting the iron to the fold, now cutting along the fold so that I have one piece of fabric for the back. Now I can easily fold this lengthwise, lay half of my pattern down very, very carefully across the center back of the pattern. With a slippery fabric, this is much more difficult, but this fabric's beautiful to work with. You notice I'm putting pins down the center area of the back all the way through. Check your fabric. Some fabrics are so fragile that a pin would leave a hole. And if that's the case, don't put the pins in down the center back. Just put them in the seam allowances. Sometimes I take magazines and different heavy things to use as weights. I like a big floppy weight, like a National Geographic magazine. This just saves me a little cutting time. But I usually like to have the full back in the pattern. It's, in my opinion, a lot more professional to have it, and often I use it with the fabric not folded but flat. And finally, the collar pieces. This is a good way to conserve fabric. And this is what's left. Great way to use the selvage. Now I do have the right sides up, the right side of the fabric up, but I did want to make sure I knew which was length grain. That's why I put that little arrow, and where the selvage was. So these are cut with the center back parallel to length grain or selvages. This I want to measure very, very carefully. The cross grain, make sure it's very, very parallel, the line of the pattern to the actual grain line of the fabric. And then the length grain, I'd like to remind you one more time, if your fabric is fragile, you want to put the straight pins in the seam allowance of the pattern only and not in the body. This fabric can take pinning and without leaving holes. And snipping the notches. Now these seam allowances are only 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just snipping about 1/8 of an inch. The notches are perpendicular to the seam. I always notch the bottom of my collar center back or front, as well as the top, because when you sew them together, the two pieces of fabric want to shift. This prevents that. These are the facings for the sleeves. So what I am notching there are the center fronts and the fold lines, the shoulder seams, the armhole, underarm seam, dart notches, and hem notch. Now to mark the tip of the dart, I put a straight pin straight through the tip. fold it on the other side and pull the paper away. And now you've marked through both layers. Put another pin on the underneath piece of fabric where that straight pin comes straight through, and I mark into the dart rather than away from the dart. So if it leaves any marks, it will be sewn into the dart. And now the tips of those darts are marked. Center back neckline. Shoulder seam notches. Armhole notches, 2 indicating back armhole, underarm, and hemline. Now I'm taking a piece of batiste. I've already torn it so it's on grain, and I've marked the length grains, and I'm going to use this for facings or interfacings. This is my upper collar, the top piece when worn, and the sleeve facing. I'm measuring to make sure that my fold is symmetrical so it will stay on grain. There's so many ways to go about this, so if you want to use a different way, feel free to. I think this lesson is mostly about keeping things on grain than layout of cutting. As long as you're cutting the body on the length, you should be fine. I could have folded the fabric for this collar, but I decided not to. I could have cut it on the fold, but I want to make sure this is exquisitely accurate. I pinned the interfacing to the wrong side of the upper collar, just to go on and have it in the right orientation, so when I go to sew it, it's already ready to go. I don't have to think about which piece am I using or which is the right or wrong side. It's already prepared for me. Laying the interfacings on the wrong side of the fabric for each of the two hem facings. Now everything's cut and ready to go.